Well, thank you very much, Marina, for this generous introduction. And thank you both, Michelle and Marina and Krista, for this amazing invitation and this great opportunity to make this link tonight between the gallery and other venues and the conference that starts tomorrow. And I thought I'd speak about a couple of projects, a couple of video projects that engaged the ecologies of oil and water. And it seemed very appropriate to, in this context of World of Matter, to come back to an earlier work where I attend artistically to the questions of resources, which is the first piece was called Black Sea Files, which came out in 2005, where I started to direct my interest towards oil infrastructures in the Caucasus and the Caspian region. And when I began my research in the region there in early 2000, the body of knowledge, like the one we're going to present tomorrow at the conference, didn't exist yet. So extraction, epistemology, petrocultures, and the like still had to be developed and to come to life. All I had then was Daniel Yergin's History of the Epic Quest for Oil, which had already been out for 10 years. It was actually quite difficult to come by information online on places like Azerbaijan or specifically the BTC pipeline. There was very little information online about that. The pipeline, BTC means Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. That was under construction at the time when I prepared my field trip in 2003. So the International Oil Consortium, which ran the BTC operations, wasn't providing any information either, especially not about the precise trajectory of the pipeline. So it wasn't very clear what I would be able to do in the Caucasus, and it wasn't clear what kind of aesthetic project I could possibly develop on this subject matter that was largely uncharted by art. What was clear, however, is that I didn't want to reproduce the singular representation of the BTC as a technological adventure, which is pretty much how the corporate consortium presented it. First, I needed to understand the strategic politics at work in this enterprise. The new oil pipeline was part of a larger European plan, not only to pass the Caucasus and access the Caspian Sea, but to reach further out into post-socialist territories and post-Cold War territories of Central Asia. In the years following 1991, Europe designed a stellar configuration of communication corridors that extended out in all directions, reconnecting itself to the territories from which it was cut off during Soviet times. These infrastructures embody a grand expansionist vision. The BTC is part of that. The pipeline is a geostrategic project of great political impact, not only for the powerful players for the region, but also for a great number of local actors, the farmers, the oil workers, the migrants, and the prostitutes. It is these subjects who populate the video and turn it into a complex human geography. And I'd like to show a few clips that are part of Black Sea Files. Black Sea Files is a 2-channel synchronized video that is usually installed as a double projection or on various monitors. And so I connected them here, I mounted them here in one frame so you could see it. So we'll see number 0. There are 10 files altogether, and they're announced by the numbers, so you'll see easily. These records are about the new Caspian oil and the deep incision made through the injured Caucasus to secure the precious fluid for the West. They speak of power that no longer resides in weapon technology, but in the possession of vital resources or the ability to procure them. Building the oil pipeline means more than the invisible transfer of fluid. It is an economic project with military objectives. I arrived on the scene at a time when long negotiated contracts had turned the region into an open ditch. I began my research with a visit to the sites and non-sites of the giant foreign intervention and started a file that would collect visual intelligence relevant to the case. Black Sea Files are used as a code name, which doesn't signify a geographic location, but points to geography as an ordering system for transnational relations. The place is literally soaked in oil. For over 100 years, the earth has been pierced down to the fossil fuel, first by the Europeans, then by the Soviet, and now by a transnational consortium. Powers have changed, but the problem remains of how to pump the Caspian crude to the west. What will it take to write the hidden matrix of this political space? When transnational relations increasingly take place in the invisibility of electronic spaces, off-road terrains, and classified zones, and when international media only features political elites and large economic stakes in the region, offering little insight into local textures. The pushing of resources on a macro level is bound to be accompanied by a myriad of human trajectories on the ground. The signing of big deals entails a million small contracts and negotiations. 2 more files so we get a sense of the construction of the piece.
The news only tell us about humanitarian crisis of international dimensions. The small everyday displacements of people, their urban struggles, their loss of land, we don't get to hear and see. When the Kurdish villages were turned to smoke and ashes, the Kurds settled on the fringe of Istanbul and Ankara and began to recycle garbage. On this spring morning, the city council of Ankara decided to raze the area to the ground, evict the Kurds, and take over the recycling business. We are looking at the struggle of 1,000 citizens who are losing their existence. In resistance, they set the garbage on fire. For them, paper is as valuable a resource as oil is for others. What does it mean to take the camera to the field, to go to the trenches? How did it get to the point where she stands at the front next to the journalists, at the very moment of the incident, without press pass or gas mask? What kind of artistic practice does such video footage document? That of an embedded artist immersed in the surge of human confusion and confrontation? How to resist making the ultimate image that will capture the whole drama in one frame? How to resist freezing the moment into a symbol? Is an image made under dangerous conditions more valuable than material found in libraries and archives? Is better knowledge that which is produced at great risk? It sounds odd, but it's risky to simply record a pipeline. Oil companies run a severe image regime. During construction, image making is prohibited. Later, it will be invisible anyway. What is the meaning of this tube in the hidden corporate imaginary of this space? What function does it have in their own secret ordering system of the Caucasus? To generate images of oil infrastructures is not an aesthetic project, it is an undercover mission. The challenge is to go undetected, probing for hidden, secret, and restricted knowledge. Are these cognitive methods any different from the ones used by geologists, anthropologists, or secret intelligence agents? They all probe different sort of sediments and plots that give meaning to this space. What is the sediment I should be probing in my artistic fieldwork? What role do I play in this plot?
Well, maybe we'll just show part of this last one, which is on the farmers.
It seemed so easy to draw a long red line on the map, but contrary to the ultimate corporate fantasy, the space was not void. 20,000 farmers along the trajectory had to yield their land, but eventually the oil company gained the right of way for the pipeline across all 3 territories. They launched a campaign that would define the land use politics for the corridor, which is as much governed by the production, dissemination, and withholding of knowledge as it is by direct interventions in national legislations.
Allah Teala nətərdir? Həmişə belə bunları özü açıq olsun ki, elə bizə görün, baxım elədilər. Bizim torpağımız o kəmərdən keçdi. Yox deyildi. Yəni o bilir də bu.
What are you going to do with the money now?
Bəs pullara nə edəcəksiniz? Demərsiniz məbləğini.
Maşın aldıq.
They bought a car.
They bought a car? So the money is the amount for a car?
Yox, evə deyirəm, məsələn, kuybuq aldı. Evə biraz 5 dənə otaqdır, hələ məsələn, biri tikdirmişik, yəni hələ...
O çəkirsən, mən qatırım.
Yox, çəkməyəm.
Çəkir.
Hə, pişirəm. Yəni özü pişirəm. Tərqət edirlər, ondan sonra... Yəni çoxdan deymişik. Hələ, məsələn, bu plan alana hələ heç sıd eləməmişik daha. Yəni Allah haqqı, heç sıd. Elə maşın aldıq, məsələn, bir maşın qızır, bir maşın odun, belə məsələsin. Bir maşın qum, yəni hələ... Xırdaparı çox.
Hər,
Köç, otun.
Fikirləşirsiniz ki, maşın lazımlı şeydir sizə ki, nə?
Hə.
Can I have a little light? I cannot see great thing. Thank you. So the pipeline runs like a red line through the video, but BTC doesn't pursue a linear, Black Sea Files doesn't pursue a linear narrative. It consists of a series of open files that allude to the collection of intelligence about the case, and hence it turns the artist into an undercover agent. Traversing the terrain, she connects the micropolitics on the ground with theoretical, speculative, and macropolitical layers of reflection. The pipeline runs through 3 countries, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, and creates its own juridical space within these nation-states. But the aim here is not primarily to place oil in a transnational context or simply to trace a powerful infrastructure at a time when it's still visible. The video captures oil and its system of distribution as something that generates great fragility among the social and biological communities on a regional and global scale. So the installation you see here was done in Aberdeen. It's usually presented either on 10 monitors that are interlinked, and there is an oil cartography that we designed with architecture bureau in Zurich, who shows the BTC pipeline in relation to other oil flows in the region. And there is a reproduction of the file structure, that is the video structure, onto the wall. So you always see what's in these videos. When you sit down, you know what you're getting into, what the content is, how long it is, and so on. So it's a very accessible kind of installation where you can start looking into file 1 or 2, or you start with 6 and 7, and you just it's to break up the linear structure also of the pipeline somehow. I'm generally using extensive fieldwork and investigative video as a form of artistic practice to engage with territories that undergo some deep transformation. My earlier videos, like Black Sea Files, follow transformations that have directly to do with globalization, the pushing for new frontiers for global capital, oil exploitation, and the expansion of power via mega infrastructures, infrastructure projects, or free trade zones. Or they have to do with the building of more immaterial infrastructures, like the long-distance migration networks I documented in the Sahara, and which are built on clandestine relations. In all these situations, I would always opt for documenting the counter-geographies of those actors who have developed strategies of mobility and survival, since these are the ones through which globalization forces find their grip. The focus was always on social reorganization. More recently, I have turned to territorial transformations that have been playing out in the background of all these scenarios all along. That is, the changes occurring in the physical and chemical composition of the Earth due to the massive geoengineering that has been going on in the last decades. My recent works explores the ecologies of oil and water, deep weather, Egyptian chemistry, and also the new collaborative piece, Forest Law on Amazonia, which will open at the Ellen Gallery tomorrow and which I will be discussing at the conference. These video works take oil and water as the undercurrent of contemporary narration as they activate profound changes in the planetary ecology. These two primordial fluids operate as a medium that records human history at the same time as they store the chemical alteration of the planet. The chemical alterations that the planet is performing. These liquids are time-based media, so to speak, similar to video. Egyptian chemistry is a multi-channel video on the Nile ecologies, some of which you can see online at the worldofmatter.net website. So I'm not going to speak about it here. I would just say that Egyptian chemistry attends to slow but continuous chemical transformations of Egypt's soil and water, which are due to major physical interventions like the High Dam and a series of barrages, but also sweeping reforms in agriculture and land rights during the years of Mubarak, which eventually led to the revolution. In this context, I should mention that my artistic practice also includes collaborative and curatorial projects. Emily and I are both part of World of Matter, and so are many of my colleagues who are here tonight. Which is a collective art and research project on resource ecologies, on human and interspecies relations with earth, matter, landscape, and the living world. World of Matter is a place of conversation about our practices and the ideas that drive them. Together, we developed this multimedia audiovisual online platform to present our media and research, which we have organized in clusters that are interlinked across the different geographies. So please check them out. You'll find your own narrative across them. So since deep weather was shown at the biennial here, I'm going to speak a bit about that piece now. It speaks of a moment of crisis. At the moment when humans thought we are technically in control of landscapes, energies, and resources, it dawns on us that we are less in command than ever, particularly given the unpredictable and nonlinear climate change we are facing in the future. There is no control. There is only the fluid circulation between what humans do and how nature responds. And nature's response is not always local. Through the intervention in the fragile local biosphere or the marine ecosystem, an unbalance is happening way over there, at long distance from the site inflicted. people are baffled on a local level by disruptions created in faraway places. We live in a new reality but cannot represent this experience to ourselves. The time asks for a fundamental recalibration of our sense of cause and temporalities. And we need to find aesthetic means to experiment with and communicate these in a way that reaches the imaginary, not just the rational mind. It's not more data and diagrams that are needed. Under the perishable sky, the world fuses together. Climate change forces us to deal with invisible dynamics. Timothy Morton speaks of global warming as a hyperobject, a very large diffuse object that is permanently present but not localized in a material sense. We cannot perceive hyperobjects as a whole. All we ever see are its footprints. Since global warming occurs in much vaster temporalities, it phases in and out of the shorter human time frame of perception. That, so Morton, is how it withdraws from our visibility. From our mortal, earthbound standpoint, the phenomena is partially eclipsed. There are gaps in our cognition that need to be breached. The geopolitical lens that zooms in on short-term impacts and revenues, for instance, is failing to help us see these larger realities. Art can play a role in conveying the immaterial and somewhat spectral nature of global warming, by bringing remote and apparently unrelated locations to interact on the same visual plane. That's what deep weather is trying to do by drawing the connection between the relentless reach for fossil resources with their toxic impact on the climate and the consequences this has for indigenous populations in remote parts of the world. The first part of the video comments on the huge open pit extraction zone for tar sands in the midst of the vast boreal forest of northern Canada, which you see here by now familiar image in Canada. After oil peak, ever dirtier, remote and deeper, layers of carbon resources are being accessed. Aerial recording of the devastated crust in the state of Alberta opens to view into the dark, lubricant geology. The extraction projects extend over an area the size of England, until recently covered by ancient spruce forest and spongy wet moss. The noise and the large new infrastructures impinge on the living and migrating space of many species, including humans. It's the loss of an entire habitat. But for Aboriginal folks, practical inconvenience is not everything. Local mythologies of the biosphere animate the landscape. The landscape contains both worlds. It's a psychosocial resource. Landscapes are never just there. They are always an expression of relations and conventions. Hence the noise, subterranean vibrations, and the invisible toxic juices seeping into lakes and rivers affect not only the biological but also the mental ecology of contamination. The disaster is under the ground, entering every living thing and transforming the genetic future. Then deep weather abruptly turns to the other side of the world, where rising planetary sea levels and extreme weather events increasingly define the living conditions in Bangladesh. Climate change, exacerbated by projects such as the Canadian tar sands, turns exposed areas unlivable. In previous glacial eras, species could migrate to other, more agreeable zones, but this is no longer possible now. Every livable space is practically occupied by other people or serves as resource to feed them. Every hectare has its owner and designated purpose. This second part of the video documents the gigantic community effort in building protective mud embankments to protect the villages from the rising sea. Hands-on work by thousands is what climate change will mean for people in the deltas of the Global South. The scenery of collective human action stands in harsh contrast to the one in Alberta, where expensive large-scale machinery replaces human labor. The two remote and simultaneously occurring scenes are connected through the atmospheric chemistry. The whispering voiceover merges with the winds that drive greenhouse gases around the planet. It links horizontal topographies. In addition, deep weather also thickens the understanding of these geographies by reaching into the interior of the Earth and extending 100 miles into the atmosphere, since fossil fuel extraction is not merely a geopolitical concern, but also a bioplanetary reality. As we scoop out geological matter from deep layers into the daylight and out into the atmosphere, global warming forces us to think in deep time. Artistic practice is not standing apart at a distance, representing. It is full engagement in the material discursive processes that shape the Earth system and our reality. At the very least, it involves thinking of how content makes its way into the world and back in the form of material relations. It means to think from in the midst, not from outside. Thank you. Emily. Oh, you're here. You're serious. Wow, that's a great surprise. Come on over. Yes, we're going to speak here.
And there's lots of water. Okay, perfect. Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm not used to flying in mid-event, so excuse me for that. I did have a chance to read Ursula's talk and rewatch Black Sea Files before coming. So what I was thinking, since we do we have roughly half an hour as originally planned? A little less?
We have about 25 minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
So that would include your conversation together and then a question period.
Yeah, so I figured that I would just pose a couple of kinds of topics or questions. We could go on and on, I'm sure. But I'm also certain that there are many questions among you, and I have more opportunities to speak with Ursula. So I wanted to start out quickly just by saying that I came across Ursula's work first in the context of geography, not art, when I was studying both as a graduate student at UCLA. And so I want to start here because in a way this combination of pieces that you shared with us tonight and spoke about sort of span a range. And I think the early works like Black Sea Files for me were so exciting as a kind of young semi-geographer because they illuminated in such a nuanced and complex way specific geographies and how they were entangled with social, political, historical kinds of contexts. The fieldwork piece was very exciting, the way in which you kind of located these hot spots and these points of resistance. And as you said at the start of the talk, which now seems quite extraordinary, that in certain ways, information that would now be accessible to many of us, just simply one had to go to the field to find out. That was where the information sort of laid. So all of that coupled with this kind of very reflexive way of thinking about image making and knowledge making was very, very exciting to me. But as you said in the talk tonight, a lot of these earlier works from the early 2000s were very connected to processes of globalization. So one topic I thought we might converse about tonight is this shift. One way to put it, perhaps, would be a shift in your own kind of thinking and way of framing your work from a set of interests around the global or globalization toward the planetary. And this came out really beautifully, I think, tonight too, and your kind of discussion of the chemical, the interest in deep weather in the kind of subterranean all the way up to the atmosphere, this kind of verticality, these physical and chemical processes and aspects that have been going on all along, but kind of an increased attention to what we might consider the planetary and what is at stake in this shift from a global to a planetary kind of way of thinking about picturing the world, or a kind of perspective world picturing system. They're very different kinds of terms. So I wondered if we could talk about that some, which might also be tied to a kind of move from geography towards something else.
Yeah. Sometimes I'd like to know also where that will lead us. We are still in that shift, and I would really be lying if I said it's all resolved, I all figured it out, I could just explain it to you. But I think the shift is, of course, one from humanities to other ways of engaging the planet, which relates more to, if it's not economic, then it's scientific, natural science, and it's definitely a domain that was a lot less familiar to me, and there was a lot of new reading to be done. But I think it had a lot to do with the emergence of new materialism and all these new philosophies that came our way, and we had to engage with, really. It seemed like such a well-resolved way of thinking about globalization in this geographic way that was spatial as a form of human geography, space that is being made through the activities humans have in that space. Whereas now with the planetary, I think it's more of a material investigation almost. So it ranges from the very minute to the very, very large. It's a completely different scale that we're talking about. I don't know if that's what you come across with these readings also. We need to visualize not just global relations that maybe were more in the digital or more in a kind of global flows realm, that you went, like I did with Black Sea Files, tried to capture the building of an infrastructure at the moment where it's still visible, because afterwards it will be on the ground and it will be gone. And that's how quick it went, right? But now we're dealing with, phenomena that we can't really see. All we see are these imprints or these indexical signs, We're looking at the earth that bear signs that we are supposed to interpret. And so I think we're, in a very different register.
Yeah, I agree with you about the kind of scale shift on one hand. On the other, a move from a kind of global framework or way of thinking to a more planetary focused, if we want to use this language, if it sticks, if we decide to have it stick. I think, perhaps it's more about a temporal scale shift as well. Yeah, a globe to planet in some ways is spatially kind of potentially contiguous, but I think this shift away from the human and towards these kind of human natural entanglements, for me at least, the writing of Dipesh Chakrabarti that calls for this whole kind of rethinking of what history might mean, and a kind of attention both to the material and the human at the same time, is quite compelling. And also, very recently, the theorist Brian Holmes reviewed the World of Matter project. It's a very beautiful piece, but he had a wonderful line in there about your Egyptian chemistry project and about his interest in kind of where metachemistry intersects with or kind of rubs up against material politics. Like for him, that's kind of where it gets really interesting, which I think also echoes this kind of thinking of a number of philosophers and thinkers that probably many of us in the room have been reading. So I have a related question, and then probably we should open it up. But it's tied to this. It's a continuation of the same question in a way, but it's tied more specifically to how this shift that I sense in your work from a kind of geographical globalization focus to a kind of planetary, ecological, earth focus, if you will, how it's reflected in the narrative voice in your works. And I even noticed tonight when you were speaking about deep weather, the way that you speak about it even as a kind of reflection on, the language is different. Certainly within the pieces, if we want to talk about Black Sea Files and Deep Weather, your narrative voice is very, very different. So if in Black Sea Files, which we heard some of tonight, there's this kind of ever-present self-questioning voice, kind of a critical voice that's wondering about your own position relative to the field, about the status of evidence, etc. In Deep Weather, which I hope some of you have seen, you mentioned this way in which this very poetic, almost kind of mythical, primeval voice of yours, kind of whispering, runs across the film and kind of blends with the atmospheric carbon emissions and the jet streams. And in a way, when you frame it that way, almost attempts to kind of be a voice of the land or the earth or a combination of people and land and time and the non-human. So I'm curious to hear more about that, and then to think about this question, which a number of people I think are also asking about, if the planet is to speak, sort of what's at stake in giving voice? How do we want to be wary about the kind of issue of personification? Is that another form kind of imposing an anthropocentrism on the earth? So I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about the narrative voice and the language.
Yeah, I definitely felt that for Deep Weather it needed a completely different voice, because usually the way I try to investigate things on the ground, those micropolitics on the ground, I linked them to a kind of a larger plane, be there more theoretical, be it more abstract, or be it more global. With Deep Weather, really, I did away almost completely with this theoretical reflection on it. So, it's more like a very short, poetic type of noticing things, engaging with small observations. But I think the narrative kind of operates almost on a legendary scale. I feel that engaging these very large scales in terms of time and space needs a more remote more distance place to speak from.
May I know from private conversations, that you've been very taken with this idea of kind of pulling back from representation or over like signification, maybe moving even further from a kind of theoretical, critical, explanatory kind of mode altogether. And Deep Weather, one really senses, if one follows kind of your work over time, that this really changes quite drastically with the Deep Weather piece.
But I feel also very often I'm a little more speechless about how to explain these shifts. It's I don't have a ready language for it, but I try. I'm getting I'm involved in the practice of finding out different ways of signifying, maybe, or asignifying. trying to move away from representation, yet we still have language, we still have images, we're caught in these conventions. There is not so much space to experiment with, but I think that I have really changed my essayist format in making this shift to a more philosophical. Actually, this is what it is. It's maybe not critical, not so much of coming out of a critical tradition of cultural studies, kind of deconstructing and so on, but it's trying to engage more directly with the material observation, with field work, and with, I don't know, with the physicality of things. So it's definitely less rewarding for speaking about it, but it's a way to proceed at this moment. But let's open maybe to the,
I think so,
to the
too.
audience.
Whoops, I'm sorry. Eduardo, can I come up and get some cordless mics from you?
Test.
You can say we are in conversation. It's not just about me.
So do we have some questions? I'm not actually hearing. Okay. Over there. Okay. Okay, this is going to be a long process.
Can you hear me? Hi. I'm a first-year master's student here at Concordia. Thank you for speaking today. My question is, I'm really interested in the relationship to this type of contemporary art practice and the role of ethics. And if you feel like your sort of whispering voice in Deep Weather and how you feel that it touches on aspects of, it's more reflective and pensive. I'm wondering if that somehow ties into the ethical aspect of engaging with your audiences. Or I guess just what's the relationship to your artistic practice and ethics in general? Does that make sense?
Well, when it comes to ethics, I mean, when you speak about climate change, I would think it's an issue of justice. You know, you very quickly come to the point of speaking about climate justice and seeing how it affects people differently on the planet and so on. So I think that would be like the most obvious. But I think that connects back to earlier works where I would always look at the counter-geography of things to contribute to a larger media landscape that already exists out there, but that leaves out a lot of players that are, I think, very important in building this global landscape. And so I'm going out of my way to collect these testimonies and these document those landscapes in the process of making. I think that's a way of bringing those communities or the situation that they're in into a theoretical and artistic conversation.
Thank you.
More questions?
Thank you, Ursula and Emily, for making it here.
Hey.
I just wanted to pick back up on that really compelling statement that emerged in, I can't remember which, it's Krista, up over here.
I know, where are you?
I'm on the right, over here.
Oh, here.
I know you're blinded by the light.
Blinded by the spotlight.
The completely mesmerizing statement that was made that oil and water are time-based media, right? And that your observations about thinking the relationship between human scales and non-human scales, or thinking these impacts involves reading the world in a different kind of way, or reading a really differently indexical medium, right? And particularly given the conversation that Emily was talking about moving from this self-reflexive kind of positionality, a kind of doubt about the document, about what evidentiary work does. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you're interpreting these kinds of signs taken for wonders, these kinds of texts in the earth, these ways in which these very indexical media represent some of these other kinds of scales in a different way than, or in conversation with your projects and your practice.
Yeah, I think one thing is maybe the scale of the images. They become these vast landscapes, you know. Whereas before I was much more involved in one-to-one a conversation with actors in the field, and so that, you know, enters a different scale immediately of mindset also. But I think for an essayist it has a lot to do with how you contextualize your topic in a larger frame. By connecting, you know, making these connections between two sides that are completely opposite of the world, you create a different relationship than if I was just looking at tar sands and critiquing the tar sands. And so the project becomes visible. I'm not just looking at something bad that's going on over here, but what interests me is to create these new relationships that we need to comprehend now, which is really understanding on a physical level that these things are connected. So I feel that art can enter this by addressing the audience or viewers on an imaginary level. It's not just on a cognitive intelligence. So I'm a bit mystified myself by the process, but I'm experimenting with it. That's the project at the moment. Or with forest law is also, you know, I'm placing it in the context of global warming, but still look at geopolitical relations that happen in a particular region. But by placing it in this larger frame, you propose to viewers, you know, a different register of interpretation. And I think that helps us reorient ourselves a bit. Yeah. What are you saying?
I was just going to say, to pick up a bit on what you said, Krista, and link it back to this question of narration or voice. I think part of what struck me so much with The Deep Weather, it was curious to hear you say that it sort of required us stepping back a bit, because there's something that feels so close in that piece that it's almost like you have to experiment with inhabiting this kind of air, as opposed to like staying within a kind of more familiar mode of reading. But I think it's a really, this is a very crucial question that gets at the heart of things.
Are there more questions? Yes.
Thank you. I love the way you just took up the sort of antonym qualities of oil and water in the way that you formally take the first part and the second part of the talk. But I was also thinking about all of the ways in which the problem of oil and water, in the spill, the leak, the Gulf, sort of amazing images too, that we have this billowing. And then the more recent oil spills under ice, how you clean up an oil spill under 2 feet of ice. I don't think anybody sort of knows. I was also wondering about the kind of formal possibilities as well that are coming together when you're engaging these materials that we think of not only as like massive ecological disaster potentials, but also of antonyms, of things that move apart, that keep refusing to mix.
That keep
refusing to mix. To me, the expression oil and water is a non-mixture in some relational proposal.
Yeah, they're no longer separate. Yeah.
We like it at a gut level a lot.
Yeah. I just noticed that these were the most powerful agent in what changes the planetary reality at the moment, And so wherever I went, I felt that there were these strong imprints of those two liquids that were reacting, and that shape pretty much geopolitics now.
One thing I like about the liquidity of them both, in a way, is that it stands a bit against this, like, what I sense to be this kind of fetishization of dirt and matter, that, like, it's almost like a carryover from the Smithson days, that a lot of the Anthropocene kind of writing it's so taken with kind of dirt and geologic kind of rock. And so it's really a nice counterpoint, in a way, just as like medium or media, the oil and the water emphasis. Yeah. And actually a number of the different primary materials that artists in World of Matter take up, like fish, cotton, they're not kind of minerals, or I mean there's quite a variation, but